Psychologists often refer to unconscious bias as our unintentional people preferences. Biases are a natural phenomena, but what we now know is that human beings essentially have a default position. We generally like to gravitate towards people who are like us. People who look like us, people who sound like us, or people who come from similar social backgrounds to us. And one way to understand how biases are and how they're formed is simply through the process of examining the brain itself and the brain's way of processing information. Daniel Kahneman has done an enormous amount of work in terms of understanding how our cognitive biases play out. And to help us to understand this, I'd like you to conceptualize the human brain. I'd like you to consider the human brain actually as two processing systems. One is we have the conscious brain, and the conscious brain is simply designed to do very complex thinking. It's designed to do reflective thinking and deliberative thinking. In the world of business, it's designed to do things like policy formation and strategy development. Then in parallel to the conscious, we also have the unconscious. And as opposed to being deliberative or reflective, the unconscious is essentially governed by intuition or instinct. And we now know that human beings generally start to make very rapid assessments of what people look like, how they sound, simply based on our kind of instincts and intuitions about what our relationship is to people who look like us or who sound like us. So there are 4 types of areas that we really need to focus on in terms of understanding how affinity bias really has its greatest impact in terms of organisational decision making. The first one is recruitment and selection. A UK study demonstrated that organisations were much more likely to hire people who had white Western sounding names. So we know that unconscious bias has a significant impact in relation to recruitment and selection, and those studies generally tend to be global in terms of how they play out. But the greatest impact moves beyond that. So within an organisational context, in terms of development and retention, managers are much more likely to allocate stretching pieces of work to individual employees that they have some kind of connectivity point with. That could be based on social background, or it may simply be based on hobbies or interests or some other kind of natural connection point. So work allocation is a particular hotspot in terms of understanding how bias plays out. The third hotspot is in relation to feedback. We're much more likely to give direct feedback to people who are like us, and we're likely to be anxious to give more direct and robust feedback to people who are significantly different from us. The fourth area really is around informal mentoring, informal support. Who are we likely to invite for coffee? Who are we likely to spend the extra 10 minutes with to give some advice and guidance when we're walking down the corridor? Or who are we likely to recommend to one of our key internal or external stakeholders? So not only do we need to think about the hotspots where unconscious affinity bias plays out, we need to start thinking about what is the impact of these processes in terms of our talent development systems. Unconscious affinity bias is exaggerated by what we call insider and outsider dynamics. Insider and outsider dynamics play out in all corporate settings. A classic example would be in a UK boardroom. The boardroom would still be dominated by generally white men. Those white men would not necessarily be aware that they have the authority and the power. Being in an insider group, they would benefit from their networks with each other. Within that same setting, you may have somebody who is different, i.e. their outgroup, based on their gender or their cultural background. The members of the outgroup would generally work to conform to those organisational norms, and they would not benefit from the unconscious bias in the same way that the in-group would. Even though these processes are fairly ingrained within human decision making, it's not impossible to change if individuals and organisations put some effort into bias control. Some very practical things that you can do to at least learn to mitigate about unconscious bias is think about who you connect with. How can you widen your social networks within a business context? My advice would be go to and check in with people who are different from you. Attend your women's development network. Attend your LGBT network if you have one, or go to your black and ethnic minority network. Those things generally will do 2 fundamental things. One is they will build your cultural competence of people who are different from you. You'll have some insight into how people who are perhaps in the outsider group who are different from you think and feel about how they work in your environment. The other thing that they can do over a long period of time is have some positive effect at the neurological level. So start to connect with people who are different from you. Other advice and guidance would be to allocate work to people who are not similar to you, give them an opportunity to shine and to demonstrate their skills and competences. More at the organisational level, it's becoming fairly standard now for businesses to take information off organisational processes, such as taking names off CVs, taking irrelevant information off recruitment processes like what university somebody went to, and really kind of examining your organisational processes and think about to what extent is unconscious bias embedded within person specifications and job descriptions, and how can you develop some systems to de-bias your decision-making processes.